Well, we have Sherry Jones with us, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with us. Um, I'm Aisha. The
Hi,
name,
nice to meet you.
yes,
Aisha, thank you for setting this up.
excuse me?
Thank you for setting this up. I really
Oh, you're
appreciate it.
welcome. You're welcome. Then we
Um,
have,
Hi, Sherry. I'm Shireen.
Hi,
Nice to
Shereen.
meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you too.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
wait,
Hi, Sherry. I'm Judy.
Hi, Judy. Pleased to
Assalamu
meet
alaikum. Nice to meet you. And Aisha is, well, we have one more person coming. And this is Nabila. Do you want to say hello to Sherry?
Sure. Hi, Assalamualaikum. Hi,
you. Hi,
Nabila.
Nabila.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Okay, we're not any of us very good at this technical stuff except for Iman. So sorry if our eyeballs are rolling in places they shouldn't. So,
I don't know what we would all have done without her. I didn't know
okay,
much about
right, we would be
it.
helpless like fish out of water. So.
so Sherry, I have to say that before I, obviously before 9/11, if I wanted to read about Islamic things, you know, Islamic history, Islamic hadith, whatever, um, my choices were very limited, and I brought a book here. Do you mind if I? Here's a book that I brought, and I don't know, you guys might be familiar with books like this.
Yeah, but it does look kind of familiar. Yeah.
um, very limited.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm grateful for the explosion in the English language for just all kinds of works Islam related.
Well, I had the same problem as you. You know, I started researching the Jewel of Medina in 2002, in the winter of 2002, so not long after September 11th, and I had a really hard time finding sources. And the internet wasn't as sophisticated then as it is now, so it was not even that easy to find resources online. So I did order some books. I found that a Muslim website selling was Muslim books or Arabic books, or but they were English, but they were Muslim books, and so I got some books kind of like they look kind of like the one that you're holding up. You know,
Right, right.
basically, I don't know if that one is, but ones I got were largely reprints of the ahadith, and which are the stories for anyone listening, the sacred stories about Muhammad's life and sayings that he is supposed to have said and regarded as sacred in the Muslim tradition. So a lot of them were collections of ahadith about Muhammad and his wives, but they don't have a lot of detail. And so it was really difficult to find information about the wives of the Prophet Muhammad, which made me even feel even more determined to write about them because I really wanted to give them their due. I feel like they obviously had a big part in his life and probably had a huge influence over, the origins and the um, development of Muslim religion. So they say behind every good man is a woman, and Muhammad had, 13 in all good women behind him. So I wanted to give them all their due.
There's Sarah. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Another person at the door.
So you slogged through. I'm assuming this is probably Iqra books because they're the major Islamic book publisher that I'm aware of, and you slogged through all of that, and
Yeah, but
um,
I also found lots of other books. I found, I read, most of what I found were biographies of Muhammad, frankly. I found, Karen Armstrong wrote an excellent book about Muhammad called Muhammad. I read a book called Mother of the Believers, I think it was called. It's, no, that's not it. It was called, shoot, I know, I could look at the back of my copy because I did have a bibliography here. There was a really excellent biography of Aisha written by a woman, a scholar who died. Oh yeah, it's called Aisha, the Beloved of Muhammad, published by the University of Chicago in 1942 by Nabia Abbott. And her book really got me excited about Aisha. I mean, I had read, when I first started becoming interested in the history of women in Islam, was after September 11th. I was actually in a bar and hanging out with some friends, and one of my more obnoxious friends, who's a very outspoken guy, he said, all those Muslims, they want to take over the world and lock all the women away. And I was shocked at that idea. And I thought, well, I better find out if this is true. I'm a feminist, and I felt like to not know this, that there were women in the world who were oppressed in this way, was really a shortcoming of mine. And so I started reading. I went to the library and I got a book by Geraldine Brooks called 9 Parts of Desire. And I got another book by Jan Godwin. They're both journalists, American journalists, and they had been in the Middle East and worked as reporters there. And they wrote about how women, Muslim women, were treated in certain countries, Middle Eastern countries. So, like, I don't remember which book it was now, but one of them wrote extensively about women being arrested for fairly minor infractions, like going out without, a man with them or something. Fairly, what we would consider fairly minor situations here, and being taken to prison and then raped there. And this is fairly routine. And then the women, because they didn't have 4 witnesses, these men skewed the Quran so that, Muhammad, according to the traditions, he instituted that 4 witnesses rule to protect women from charges of adultery, perhaps resulting from Aisha's own adventure in the desert with Safwan. But it was turned around so that if you've been raped and you don't have 4 witnesses, you can't even bring rape charges. And so these women were dishonored and they were just treated terribly. And both of these books, to put things in context and basically to say this is not what Muhammad envisioned for women, they both told the story of Aisha. And they mentioned, I was surprised to find that the Islamic prophet had not only one wife, but supposedly a total of 13. Some say more, even. But scholars have stuck pretty well with the 13 number. And that he was, a sexual person. He had children. He had wives who were competing with each other for a time with him. And, I'm not a Christian now, but I used to be one, and I was always kind of skeptical of the idea that the Christian prophet, Jesus, didn't have any kind of sexual life. I mean, he was a man, he was a human being, and, some branches of the Christian religion even go so far as to not to deny that Mary ever had sex. His mother, supposedly it was a virgin birth, and then she died a virgin even though she had other children. So I never really bought into the desexualization, the separation of sex and spirituality. I think sexuality and spirituality are very closely intertwined because they both result in the creation of life. And so I was fascinated by this idea that the Prophet Muhammad loved, he had desires just like every other man, and that it kind of makes makes maybe sexuality a more acceptable gift from God as opposed to something that we have to fight against. So as I read Aisha's story in these two books, I became totally entranced with her. At first, I felt a lot of sympathy. You know, oh wow, this 9-year-old girl married to this man old enough to be her grandfather, and how terrible for her. But then I read this book by Nabia Abbott about her, and I gained a completely different understanding of Aisha as this totally strong, empowered young woman that who must not have been oppressed by her husband, the prophet of God, or she wouldn't have grown up to be this strong, empowered woman. He basically raised her, and she was amazing. She was the most famous and influential woman in the history of Islam, and she went on to fight battles. You know, fight in the Battle of the Camel, the first Islamic civil war. She was a political advisor to Muhammad and then to the caliphs after him, and she also became like the greatest spiritual leader of her time after Muhammad died. So I felt so much admiration for her, and then also the stories that I read in Nabia Abbott's book about what a witty, cheeky woman she was. You know, how she'd say things to Muhammad like, oh, you know, God certainly hastens to do your bidding, when he had a revelation telling him that he could marry his adopted son's ex-wife, Zainab. So I love that she was brave and courageous and cheeky and mischievous, and that she was also compassionate. You know, she used to nurse the orphan lambs. And she was just a really admirable character to me, and I felt that I wanted to introduce her to the Western world because I assumed that everyone who was Muslim, especially in other countries, where they're going to the, you know, Arabic Muslim schools, that they would know about her. But I didn't think that in the United States, I mean, no one I knew had ever heard of her. So I felt really privileged to be able to tell her story and make her better known in the Western world. I hope that's what you were wanting me to talk about. I've just gone on and on. So,
Well, you definitely humanize her. And sometimes I feel like we Muslims, you know, we have so much reverence for the Prophet and his family and all of that, that we sometimes almost deify him and his family to the point where we can't imagine that, oh, I can't believe he, you know, that he must have had that thought, or he could have even had, you know, a certain thought, or, you know, purely human thoughts. And you just bring that to life in a very realistic way.
well, you know, I met a woman when I live in Spokane, Washington, which is eastern Washington, and a woman came here to live from Saudi Arabia. Her name was Nejla, and she's a wonderful, delightful young woman. She came here to go to college. Her family lives here now, but they're originally from Saudi Arabia. And she had a very privileged life in Saudi Arabia, so much so that she was even considering going back there to live after college, because she said life for her was easier because she had all the privileges, the wealth, and, you know, fancy cars and things like that. But she said that when she came to Spokane, someone gave her a copy of Jewel of Medina, and she said that when she opened it to read, that she read the first pages and had to shut the book. She said her heart was just pounding. And I said, well, why is that? Were you afraid? And she said, yes, I was very afraid. And I said, well, what were you afraid of? And she said, well, we never think of the prophet, like you just said. We don't think of him really as a human being. He was sacred, so sacred to us that, we don't even imagine really what his life would have been like, as a human man, as a human person, even though he did say in the Quran, I'm a mortal man. And I think that it was pretty clear to me as an objective, non-Muslim person, journalist by my training and profession, that he wanted to be remembered that way. As you may remember, when he died, Abu Bakr, his best friend and advisor and successor to the caliphate, spoke and reminded everyone that Muhammad was dead, but that God lives on. And to me, that was another sign that, they didn't want Muhammad to be remembered as a god, because he wasn't. There's only one God, Muhammad said. And so I asked her, she said they just weren't used to reading about Muhammad that way, and it frightened her. And I said, what were you afraid of? And she said, I was afraid it would change my life. And she did finish the book, and she said it did change her life, that she came away with a totally different understanding from the Muhammad that she learned about in school, and Aisha that she learned about in school was not the same. And she understood Muhammad to be, as I believe he was, peace-loving, egalitarian, compassionate, human, and a very loving person who was always concerned with doing the right thing by other people. We have this so often, and I think increasingly in the world, because of extremism and terrorism. There's a lot of Islamophobia, and there's a lot of accusations going around that Muhammad was warlike, and there people pull verses in the Quran out of context, and or they pay more attention to certain verses than others. But Muhammad's lifestyle, the way that he lived, according to what I've been able to find about him by scholars, not necessarily even Muslims, but by people who were maybe objective, approached the subject matter objectively and were concerned with getting to the facts of his life. He's portrayed as being, for example, very egalitarian. in the Muslim Ummah, the first Muslim community in Medina, women were right there alongside the men. In battle, in the mosque, women and men prayed alongside each other in the mosque. There was no separating out from what I can see. The stories have them all together. There were no, Muhammad didn't put restrictions on women that he didn't put on men also. He admonished people from both genders to be modest in their dress and in their appearance. Women were among his inner circle of advisors. Women spoke out. He often consulted his wives and many other women in the community for political advice. And Salama, something I didn't write about in my book, in the Jewel of Medina, but did happen. Salama, who was apparently very feminist, and I could have written a book about her, actually. She's fascinating too, very fascinating, strong woman. She's the one who asked Muhammad, why don't you ever mention women in your recitations, your revelations? And he went away and went back, and a few days later, he did have a revelation that placed men and women equally. He said we're all created from the same soul. I mean, he doesn't get much more egalitarian than that.
Right, and we learn that in Sunday school. We Muslim kids, we learn that year after year.
Mhm.
But the way that you present it, just so much more interesting. Yeah.
Water too, really?
Yeah.
How can that be?
Well, thank you.
In fact, that was the thing. I mean, I was floored at how accurate everything was in the novel with historical records, Sunni and Shia. Obvious. I mean, it's obvious you draw from both traditions.
Well, I did a lot of research. I mean, like I said, I had a hard time finding sources, but I worked on the Jewel of Medina for um, 6 or 7 years, and I went to libraries, university libraries, and I looked in bibliographies of every book I read to find more sources. And then I also had to, like, almost the hardest part was finding out about what their houses looked like and what the clothes they wore, what kind of clothes they wore and what they ate. That was pretty difficult, but I was fortunate to I just kept hunting. And as a journalist, I developed a lot of research skills that came in really handy with this book. So yes, I'm very proud of the historical accuracy. I did a couple of things that I took creative license, literary license, in a couple of instances. For example, we don't know if Aisha ever used a sword, and in my book, she does have a sword. To me, the fact that she was on the battlefield, and she is known to have been present at 3 of Muhammad's battles at least, that tells me she must have had some knowledge of weaponry and how to defend herself, um, or acquired it out there on the battlefield. And but I gave her a sword as a symbol of her power. And as you may remember, I had Muhammad give all the wives a necklace. Every time they consummated the marriage and the woman became his true, wife, he would give her a necklace. And Aisha, who was supposed to be very jealous and competitive with Muhammad's other wives, she never got a necklace. But at the end, she gets a sword. And to me, that was all a metaphor for her strength and for the Prophet Muhammad's empowerment of women. I read a book about the Persian Empire during this time, and it was when I was researching the Sword of Medina. And a lot of that takes place in what is now Iran, as the Muslim Empire expanded. And the author said that during Muhammad's lifetime, the women of Medina in the Ummah were the envy of the women in all the surrounding of the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, and all the surrounding countries. They were the envy because everybody knew that they had all these rights and all this empowerment, and Muhammad did that.
Can I interject here? I'm fascinated by what's happening in this evolution of Westerners, people with Western sensibility, people who grew up here, trying to understand and absorb and, in some cases, reinterpret Islamic Eastern tradition. I'm a convert to Islam. I've been a convert for 30 years. So I've watched a long evolutionary process of understanding and interest in the Muslim world among Americans. I'm a native-born American. So I'm fascinated by your interest in this topic, and I know you're representative of an interest that was kindled after 9/11, when everybody was so shocked, and trying to understand how the heck could this have happened. What have we been missing? What do we not understand about this civilization? I'm fascinated by how you took the character of Aisha and gave her agency, and you obviously did a lot of research. Everything you could find, more and more is being translated into English. But when you started, you're right, there wasn't that much except the kind of booklet that Aisha held up when we started, which is, very conservative, traditional conservative interpretation of the faith that was translated into English and distributed through mosques here for years. But I guess my question or my comment is, or no, I guess it is a question. To what degree, sorry, I'm feeling my way through this, to what degree were you aware that you were even though you're a journalist and you're an objective journalist, but you inevitably are projecting a Western sensibility onto Aisha, and to what degree were you aware that that's what you were doing? Were you conscious of that? And the second question is, were you shocked when Random House, after this advice of a scholar in Texas, decided not to publish, and then you had to find a different publisher? Were you surprised by that?
Well, in terms of projecting a Western sensibility, yes, I was always aware that I come to any work that I produce with my own point of view, my own history. I may have brought a Western sensibility, but I also bring a feminine sensibility. And to me, that was so much more important. Yeah. As I did my research, as I wrote my novel and revised it 7 times, I listened to Arabic music. I took 2 years of Arabic language and culture at the University of Montana, where I was living at the time. I took a history of Islam course taught by a Persian professor, Mirdad Kia. I spent, my Arabic professor and I became very close. He came to my house for dinner. We walked every day for a number of blocks from our university to our cars after class. We had many long discussions in his office about Muhammad and Islam, and so I did my best. At that time, I really would have loved to have traveled to the Middle East. But it was right around the time when Danny Pearl had been beheaded and other Westerners were being captured and beheaded. And I was also working part-time as a newspaper reporter, making a small salary, as newspaper reporters generally do. And the price of going to Saudi Arabia was very high. And I learned from my professors at the University of Montana that I wouldn't even be allowed into Mecca or Medina, which is where my book is set. So it began to feel like it wouldn't be worth the $7,000 to $10,000 it would have cost me to go, which I didn't even have. So I didn't go. But I'm not sure that. So yes, I was aware, and I tried everything that I could think of to really move beyond that. But I also, and I've had people say to me, well, what right do you have to tell this story? You're not Muslim, you're not from the Middle, you're not from Saudi Arabia, you're not Arabic. And that's always been my response is, no, but I'm a woman, and so was Aisha. And I feel that I know a woman's heart, and she definitely had a woman's heart. I tried really hard to not glorify the time they lived in. I know my book's been called Orientalist, but I think people who use that term either don't understand my book or they don't really understand the meaning of the word Orientalist, because in no way do I glorify um, that time period. I hope that I've made it very clear that they were starving, that it was dirty and dusty and hot, that they were persecuted, um, how difficult it was to be living in that time. Um, and as far as Random House is concerned, their decision to cancel publication, or they indefinitely postponed publication of the book. And that was a huge surprise to me. My editor, who had, before they made the offer to buy my books, the Jewel of Medina and the Sword of Medina, my editor called me. Usually before an editor makes an offer on your book, they'll call and talk to you. And she did, and she said, do you think this book will be controversial? And I said, maybe I was naive, but from my point of view, the Jewel of Medina was very respectful of Islam, and I had gone in as a journalist. I didn't know what I was going to find. I might have found Muhammad, to be a totally different person, but I found him to be all these wonderful things, and I said, no, it's very respectful. I don't think that it's going to make anyone angry. There might be some people might argue with some of the things I found, but I don't think it's really going to incite riots or anything like that. And she agreed with me. She loved the book, and actually everyone on the editorial team really loved it. And we all agreed that the time for this book was now, because of all the hatred going around, and all the hateful rhetoric going around about Islam, and the misinformation about how Muhammad treated women and how Islam treats women, or supposed to treat women. So yes, I was very surprised when, just a couple of months before the book was supposed to come out, Random House, my agent called me and told me that they were going to indefinitely postpone. Well, actually what happened was she called and told me that there was a problem with the book, that the professor in Texas who had written the book about Aisha, that I had read as one of my sources, that she had sounded the alarm to Random House. They actually, it's ironic because they asked me, Random House asked my agent if I could provide them with names of some professors, some scholars who might endorse my book because of the historical accuracy. They were hoping that teachers would use this book in the classroom to teach students about Islam. And in fact, that has happened at the University of Minnesota. But I didn't know any professors except, at the University of Montana. And I didn't think that's what they had in mind. I was imagining they wanted, bigger schools. And so I said, well, you could send them to the professors whose books I use for research. And I gave them a few names. And one of them, this professor at the University of Texas, she flipped out. And she said that my book was dangerous because it portrayed Aisha as a sexual person, and that, as you know, there aren't really any sex scenes in the Jewel of Medina. There's one scene when Aisha is a little girl spying on a newly married couple, and it sets the scene for her own fear of consummation of her marriage. But other than that, there are no sex scenes in the book. But this professor said that my Aisha is like the Virgin Mary in Islam. Excuse me, I have a cold. So anyway, this professor said Aisha is like the Virgin Mary, and that if you publish this book that's portraying Aisha as a sexual person, then you're going to be attacked by terrorists, and the author won't be safe, you won't be safe, your employees won't be safe, and so then Random House, they decided to, the higher ups, the executive editor, etc., at Ballantine Books, who was the division of Random House that was publishing the book. They decided to ask 3 more professors. And I don't really know why they wanted to ask professors, but they did. They asked 3 more professors what they thought. And I never got to see what they said, but I was told that each professor had a different idea. Nobody mentioned sex anymore. Nobody mentioned Aisha being a sexual person. Somebody said that my portrayal of Ali would be offensive to Shiites. I remember that. And I don't remember what the other 2 said, but they were all different. So based on that, Random House decided that they would indefinitely postpone publication of the Jewel of Medina and the Sword of Medina, which I had just finished writing and submitted to them. They hadn't read it yet, but they said they were going to postpone publication of these books until they felt like it was safe to bring them out, until the controversy died down. And I said, well, actually, the time for these books to come out is now, when people are talking about Islam, and when Islamophobia is so high. This is when these books need to come out. They're relevant now. We're not going to wait until they're irrelevant to bring the books out. So I canceled my contract with them. And so yeah, that's a long answer, but yes, it was a huge surprise, and it was, not that it matters now, but it was hugely devastating for me. You can imagine being a first-time author and the thrill of having Random House. I mean, we had an auction. We had so many publishers interested in publishing these books. There was an auction. And Random House came in with a big offer, and they preempted everyone else. And we had everything all set, and they were going to send me on a big tour. And they had all these different publications who were going to write about the book, and it was just so exciting. And then suddenly, the book was supposed to come out in August, and around the end of May, they decided that they weren't going to publish it. So it was devastating. I cried every day for 2 months until I rallied, and I found my inner Aisha, my sword, and we found another publisher. So.
I did have another question. I noticed that you stayed away from pulling Quran into it. You talk about things that happened in Aisha's life that were directly related to Revelation, and you do talk a couple times, or reference in the book a couple times, and I only read the Jewel of Medina so far. I haven't read the Sword of Medina yet. But you don't quote Quran, and you didn't include any Quranic passages. Did you make a conscious choice to do that? Did you not want to go there?
Well, the Quran is, God, I know I'm going to offend people if I say this, but my research has shown me that the Quran is kind of under question. It was under question even at the time. If you read the Sword of Medina, there was a scene where, everything was memorized. And yes, people had very prodigious memories, and they still do in the Middle East, where they're taught to memorize the Quran from front from the first word to the last. And then my teacher said they have to stop. Like, the teacher will open the Quran and start on a verse, and they have to start reciting from there. So they have to really basically know it backwards and forwards. And our memories are hugely capable of all these amazing things, and they were really making use of that in that time before most people could write things down. But there is also some controversy over the Quran. After Muhammad died, there were these various efforts because there were these different Qurans floating around, and different people's memories were different. And even today, when you read, like, I have a 4-volume history of the Prophet Muhammad. I think the author was a man named Ibn Kathir, or maybe that's wrong. Anyway, a 4-volume history of the Prophet Muhammad, and he'll say, like, he'll give like 4 or 5 or more different versions of the same story, telling you, the chain of transmission, who said it first, and then who they told, and then who they told, and who they told, and who they told. And then he'll say, after he gives all these different versions, he'll say, but Allah knows best. Well, the Quran kind of evolved the same way, and maybe it was all divinely ordered. I don't know. The different There were all these different versions of the Quran floating around, and so there was an effort to, choose one. I think it was Uthman, Caliph Uthman, who chose one and had one compiled and paid somebody to do it, or got someone to do that. I don't know if he paid him, but he got someone to do that, to compile one Quran, and they ordered all the other copies of the Quran destroyed. And someone came to him and said, this old man, and who was one of the Quran keepers, one of the memory keepers of the Quran, and he came to Uthman and said, you've got it all wrong. Like, the version that you're doing is the version that you're keeping is wrong. You've made all these mistakes. And Uthman had him thrown out. And according to this history, they threw him out and so hard into the street that he broke 2 ribs. So I just thought that, that was part of it. I also didn't think it would be that interesting, frankly, to read. I felt like I wanted to show, not tell. I wanted to show what life was like. I wanted to show the stories. And we don't know which verses of the Quran, we don't know which recitations of Muhammad are associated with which events. We don't know when he recited this or that. I mean, for one thing, the book isn't arranged chronologically. It's arranged according to length. I think it has the shortest to longest, or the longest to shortest. I don't recall which, but it doesn't. The surahs aren't arranged chronologically, so we don't know when he said this or that. And heaven forbid I should get that wrong. That would totally, I think, hamper the credibility of my book. So it was those various things, like not being sure about exactly what he would have said, because things may have gotten changed. We don't really know, and not knowing when he said it, and then also not wanting to say this verse is about that, because nobody can really do that. I mean, we don't really always usually even know. So that's another long answer.
It was probably a good decision.
Well, I really wasn't concerned about offending anyone. I'm a journalist. I was a journalist for, I've been a journalist for 30 years. I'm not really practicing that anymore, but I could. I think once you're a journalist, you're probably always a journalist. And very concerned with being factual, getting the facts right, getting the history right. Only thing I really made up in that book were when I didn't know what the motives were for something, I would try to figure out what they were, and then also I had to make up the dialogue, because we don't really have most of that. So whenever there are 2 people talking to each other, or more than one person, then also Aisha's her motives for going out into the desert with Safwan, and introducing him as a character from her childhood. I used my imagination to establish that. But yeah, I really wanted to stick as close to the true history as possible, because that's what the book is about. I'm trying to give an authentic portrayal of the time and of the people, to put a human face on Islam.
You took the skeleton that's available to us, and you fleshed it out from a feminist perspective, which gives Aisha a sense of agency that I think is very refreshing. And I think a lot of people who read it, maybe like your Saudi friends, will be, will start looking at things maybe in different ways than they did before. And that's what journalism is about. That's what novels are about, to make us take a fresh look at realities, that maybe we've only looked at in certain ways, both from, and I think your book will have that impact on Westerners and Easterners. One thing I would encourage you to do, if you ever get a chance, is to go to Istanbul and go to Topkapi Palace and look at the sacred relics that are there from the life of the Prophet. I think you'd be fascinated by seeing what the Ottomans apparently collected these relics, and now the Saudis would not want to display them because they don't, they're adamantly against any kind of display of any relics or anything that harkens back to history. That's part of their interpretation of Islam. But the Ottomans collected this stuff. So there's a robe of the Prophet that's, of course, now in this jeweled box, kept in a very fancy, receptacle. There's allegedly what was, I think it was Hafsa's chemise, which is very plain. A lot of utensils, and also a lot of the swords, including the Prophet's swords. And
Yeah, I believe I saw Al Mathur, the bejeweled sword that's in my book. I think I saw that online, and it was in a display case. Yeah, it must have been in Turkey. Must have been in that museum.
But yeah, that's fascinating. But anyway,
I have been to Egypt since then. I went. Oh, I don't know what happened there.
I muted it, and I.
Woo!
Sorry about that. Don't touch it. Here, you hold it.
Okay.
That's where her face changed.
Anyway, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes. So you were in Egypt, huh?
Yeah, I went to Egypt to research my book, Four Sisters, All Queens. I got back. I have great timing. I got back 3 weeks or 2 weeks before the Arab Spring. So I just missed it. As a journalist, I was like, darn, I should have stayed longer. I could have been right there in the middle of things. But then not too long after that, I was really glad that I had left when I did, gotten out when I did. Didn't see it coming, except that I saw that a lot of people hated Mubarak. I mean, everywhere you went, you saw his picture everywhere, and then you heard people complaining about him everywhere. Nobody liked him. But so I got a feeling, and I went around we had a great tour guide, and he took us around to all these Muslim sites, mosques, and the Muslim, old Muslim quarter of Cairo. I went to, and then I also went to, the reason I went to Egypt was to see where King Louis IX had landed in the Crusades, and I had also wanted to see where he was held prisoner, and so that was really fascinating too. But I got a sense of Middle Eastern history and Islam, what it's like to hear the call to worship 5 times a day. I found it incredibly beautiful. I really loved it, and the devotion of people to Islam, and so that was, really a great experience. I don't know that if I had been able to do that before I wrote the Jewel of Medina, I don't think it would have affected the book, because I'm not sure that going to the setting of the Jewel of Medina, going to Saudi Arabia today, would provide me with much insight into what Islam was like during that time, what people were like during that time, or even what the cities looked like during that time. Because, from my understanding, they've been, and even the Kaaba, the cube where they worship, has been completely revamped. redone. And the mosque that Muhammad founded has been completely redone also. Um, but I was able to find a travelogue by I don't know, 13th century, I think, travel writer, and he traveled through Mecca and Medina, and he actually published these drawings of the mosque, so of the original mosque. So we had like the drawing of the floor plan for the original mosque, and then he showed you where like they had piped in water, so they had these copper or somehow copper or metal pipe coming in that brought in the water for them to wash before when they entered the mosque, and um, he showed you where that was located, where the tree stump that Muhammad stood on to give his sermons, where that was located. I mean, all these different. It was great to have all that detail. Excuse me, but it's been expanded and expanded, as Islam has grown.
I was there.
It wouldn't be recognizable. You were?
I was there recently, and I would have to agree that it's just malls, shopping malls everywhere.
Yeah. Oh, well. It was a merchant. I mean, Mecca was a merchant city.
Exactly.
Then, so.
Okay, I have a question, I guess. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I did not read Jewel of Medina. I read the Sword of Medina, so the post-Muhammad era. And Aisha is a pretty controversial figure. I mean, there's some people, the Sunnis revere her, but the Shia are pretty hard on her. Even just recently, a couple years ago, there was some Iranian Ayatollah who was saying, Aisha's in hell and she's burning in hell, and people were, freaked out about that. But I'm just wondering, when you looked at your sources, did you kind of identify them as Sunni or Shia? And then my second question is kind of, a lot of people have put forward Fatima as being the ideal Muslim woman, as to sort of, make the Shia and the Sunni happy. And I wonder what your thoughts are as of Fatima as, the ideal Muslim woman, especially as a feminist.
Well, I don't know if there's an ideal Muslim woman. I mean, is there an ideal woman, period, or an ideal man, period, even though I know Muslims consider Muhammad to have been that. Christians consider Jesus to have been that, but I don't even know if Muhammad would agree with that. I mean, he was, like I said, as we've already said, he was very adamant that he was just a human being. He was just a man like anyone else. And why did God single him out for revelations, or the angel Gabriel? Well, maybe it's partly because Muhammad was listening. I mean, when you read about I'm sort of getting off your question, but I just want to say, when you read about his life before he had his first revelation on Mount Hira in that cave, he was going up and meditating day and night. I mean, he was a total spiritual seeker, and he was not worshiping the God that came down, that sent an angel down to him. They were polytheistic, so they had several gods. I think they had three, and one of whom was a female goddess. So, he was listening. I mean, I like to think that as I meditate, I do my own meditative practice. I think, wow, all the great spiritual prophets of our time were first spiritual seekers. Even if you know about Jesus and Christianity, he wandered around in the wilderness for 40 days, and he was obviously seeking. And so, maybe Muhammad was listening. He was the one listening, and so he was receptive. So anyway, ideal woman, I don't know. I know that Fatima apparently really just didn't like Aisha. And they had they had their struggles, and I think that she was probably, as my book, The Jewel of Medina, shows, she was probably jealous. She was, you may not realize this, but I have read a number of scholars who've said that probably those, Muhammad had 4 daughters, and probably those first 3 were actually not his, because when you think about how old Khadijah was when they married. I mean, how would you have? She was 40 years old. How would you have 4 kids after that? Especially then, when conditions were so tough, and we didn't have they didn't have the sophisticated health care that we have today. They think that she had been widowed twice, and they think some scholars say that probably those first 3 daughters were children from her previous marriages. And then Fatima was Muhammad's daughter. And that maybe explains why she seemed to be his favorite of the 4 and had a very close relationship with him. She was not that much older than Aisha, and if Aisha did join the household at a young age, and that's also a dispute, by the way, but if she did join the household at a young age, it's possible that Fatima felt jealous, just as jealous as I might have felt when my mother had my younger sister, I as the older child and having gotten all the attention. Fatima probably never expected that her dad would bring someone into the household who was even younger than her and give her all that attention. She probably always expected that she would be his baby. And so when you add to that Ali's rivalry with Abu Bakr, who was Aisha's father, and for anyone who might be listening, Ali was Muhammad's cousin, who was the youngest son of the uncle who had taken care of Muhammad after Muhammad's parents died. And so Muhammad, sort of to return the favor, took Ali into his household and raised him, basically as a son. And so, Ali had this rivalry with Abu Bakr because Abu Bakr was Muhammad's best friend, and they were sort of, rivals for who was, the closest advisor to Muhammad. And at the same time, Abu Bakr's daughter comes into the household, and Fatima, who married Ali, may have had a rivalry there for Aisha. There certainly does seem to have been 2 camps in the harem, and there was a group of wives who were sort of a constellation around Aisha, and another group who were aligned with Salama, Fatima, and Zainab, who didn't like Aisha. And the Jewel of Medina is written from Aisha's point of view. She's the protagonist, so everything is seen through her eyes. And I recognized in that book, because of that, Ali doesn't get he gets kind of a bad rap. And so does Fatima. And I think that, we're all complex, and few of us are totally bad or totally good. And so I was glad in the Sword of Medina, I got the opportunity. I decided to write it from 2 different points of view. I alternate the chapters between Aisha and Ali. The climax of the book is going to be the Battle of the Camel, which is when Aisha and Ali, their followers, ended up fighting against each other. This big battle that started the Sunni-Shia split in Islam over whether or not the caliphate should go to, supposedly democratically chosen leader, but actually it was an elite group of men who were choosing, or Muhammad's heirs. Some said that Muhammad would never have wanted a dynasty. So in the Sword of Medina, you get, I think, a much more sympathetic portrayal of Ali and of Fatima than you do in the Jewel of Medina, because I'm telling part of the story from Ali's point of view. Although Fatima died pretty quickly after the book starts. She dies because that's what happened. After Muhammad died, she died pretty soon after that. And they think maybe of the same fever, the same kind of fever that he caught, the same virus or the similar virus to the one he got. And, Aisha actually in the Sword of Medina, when you read the chapters from Ali's point of view, Aisha doesn't look so great. She looks kind of bratty and arrogant and bossy and hard to get along with. And she probably was all those things to some extent. So I wouldn't say Aisha was the ideal Muslim woman. I wouldn't say Fatima was the ideal Muslim woman. Based on what I know, if I had to choose an ideal, I don't know, it might be Khadija. Although I have also read that was Muhammad's first wife, who isn't in either book except as a memory. But she was with him when he had his first revelations and really supported Muhammad and encouraged him. First time I ever heard a lecture, anyone talk about Muhammad or Islam, it was before I was even researching these books, and I heard a professor give a lecture basically saying that Muhammad and Khadija were opportunists and that they saw a way to become famous and maybe make some money, and that's why Muhammad he'd been traveling in Syria, and he'd been traveling in all around with the caravans, and he'd become exposed to Judaism and Christianity, and he felt embarrassed that his own culture was polytheistic with all these different gods, and it seemed to him kind of immature, not as sophisticated as having just one god. And so, they're saying that maybe he and Khadija kind of cooked this whole revelation thing up, but I kind of went in thinking maybe that was true, but then when I started doing my research and I saw how they suffered, the persecution they suffered, Khadija died in the desert because of a boycott by the merchants of Mecca against Muhammad. They banished him and his followers into the desert and refused to supply them with food, and Khadija died in the desert, and they think probably because, she was weakened by the hot sun and no food, and, why would you undergo that kind of persecution if you were faking it? I think they must have been very sincere. So. Does anyone have any more questions?
Just want to take a break, or?
It's fine. Okay. I think I asked all mine.
Do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, ask away. Well, Shireen mentioned that there's a book called Mother of the Believers by Kamran Pasha. Have you heard of this book?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
Yeah, I know the author, Kamran Pasha.
Okay.
Yeah.
We haven't read that one. Yeah, no. I just became aware of it myself just now.
Oh, yeah. It's a book that it's about Aisha's life, and it encompasses both the her life with Muhammad and then also her life after Muhammad's death. So it's like the jewel and the sword all together in one book.
Except from a man's perspective. See, it doesn't have your the feminine touch and the well, I don't know. I haven't read it, but
yeah, it's kind of a more yeah, I don't know. He's actually, but in his defense, he's I think he's Pakistani by birth, and he's a Muslim.
Yeah.
So he's been on the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and so he's got the Muslim perspective. The Jewel of Medina and the Sword of Medina have been published in lots of different countries. And um, the the um, the thing that keeps coming back to me in country after country is this challenging of me being not being a Muslim, in writing the book. So I often would say, like I told a reporter in Sweden that I think that um, writing the Jewel of Medina and the Sword of Medina as a non-Muslim gives me a certain kind of credibility that I couldn't get if I were Muslim because I don't have an agenda. I never had an agenda.
Right.
My agenda, I didn't start out with an agenda to write a flattering portrait of Islam or to redeem Islam in anyone's eyes. I started with an agenda of finding out who these people were and portraying their lives, especially Aisha, especially her life. So, I'm curious about um, did anyone feel offended by anything that I had written in the book? Um,
I'll start off. I was vaguely familiar with a little bit of the controversy. I didn't really know all the details, but I'm always open to reading new things. So I thought I would just read it, just to check it out, and I was floored after I read it at the feminine touch and the human touch to all these stories that I already knew, right? I mean, I knew what was going to happen because I should give you a little background. My parents are immigrants from India. I grew up in America. However, while we were growing up, Islam was very important to my family. We were all named after the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet. Their stories were drilled into us from a young age. So, in terms of the plot, I knew what was going to happen. But, but the feminine touch and the human touch, I was floored. And then I had to look you up online because I was reading this and thinking, this is not offensive. This is human. This lady obviously has a lot of admiration, for the Prophet and his family. And I couldn't understand the controversy behind it. And then, of course, yeah. Well, I know Muslims, let's just say that. That whole incident with Aisha and the desert, that did it.
with Aisha and what?
Yeah, the desert, that.
Oh,
That,
right.
in my opinion, that's probably what.
What really happened?
Well, no, I mean the kind of reception she got for her book because of the way she presented all of that.
Oh, you think that was the
Yeah. I mean
Yeah.
I think that's where you
Yeah.
took most artistic license, I think, because that rendition of that story I've never read in any Islamic source anywhere. Of course, we're all told according to Hadith and Sunnah that she lost her necklace and that's why she stayed behind to looking for her necklace. But you turned it into what would, from our perspective in the 20th century, be a much more realistic scenario, especially creating her whole life story and the relationship she would have had with with this man as a child and then being married off to an older man. You created a whole scenario there which makes it very believable from a humanistic perspective, and makes it make sense from a humanistic perspective. But I would think that that's probably one of the areas where the people who critiqued your book, the scholars who critiqued your book, would have found that maybe you went too far. I enjoyed it, but I'm all for free speech. I'm all for, we should be able to write and discuss and, with no barriers at all. So I support what you did, and I think what you did is great, and I love the book. It was a page turner for me. So I'll let you answer Aisha's question.
Well, I want to say that my first draft of the book, the first version I wrote of the Jewel of Medina did not have. I didn't have that stuff about her relationship with Safwan. I had her going out into the desert and coming back. I mean, I started the book the way it did, with people accusing her, but I never addressed what really happened because I recognize that nobody knows.
Right.
And, you know, it might be said that she lost her necklace, but that's not what the Shiites say.
Right.
And, you know, that's what the Sunnis say. And I was aware that there were at least two different versions of that story. And I also know that when Muhammad, I think like one of my favorite stories is when Muhammad, she was with her parents, and after the scandal, after she'd gotten back, and her mother was like, "Come on, Aisha, tell him you didn't do anything with Safwan." And she said, "Oh, I'm not going to do that, because if I tell you that I did, I would be lying. But if I tell you that I didn't, you won't believe me. So I'm going to let God give you the answer. Just going to leave it in God's hands." And I thought, that is so smart. I just love that story. She just like, what a diplomat. And but I was working with a professor in the creative writing department at the University of Montana, and she said to me, "Sherry, you have to take a stand. You have to tell us what happened in the desert. You can't write this book without telling us what happened." And so I tried to sort of mix the two. I tried to imagine a woman who was 9 years old, although this, like I said, scholars dispute that. I don't know if you're aware of that, the dispute over
Yes.
age.
Yes. Yeah.
Sure.
But a girl who was 9 years old when she married a man who was 54, and what that would have been like. And, you know, this other man who was presumably younger, a young soldier, coming back with her. You know, and I'm also kind of wondering, you know, really, how could they leave her behind and not know? I mean, how could that happen? I mean, how far away was she? She didn't hear them taking off. You know, so I mean, like, I don't know what a caravan was like then. I know that, you know, they had their cookware and they had everything with them, and I'm assuming it was noisy. I mean, camels make a lot of noise. You ever heard one bellow? It sounds like belching, and so I really tried to think, well, you know, what would be realistic if I didn't have any of these religious stories, or I didn't have to worry about who I might offend with this. What do I think might have really happened? And I thought, well, I think it's really possible that she stayed behind on purpose. But I don't believe that she would have been unfaithful to the Prophet Muhammad, because it doesn't jive with who I know Aisha to be. And so I thought that maybe she, you know, had second thoughts or had regrets about it. But yeah, it was very controversial. I know that some people got very upset by it. But it's as I have often said in the press, you know, each of us has our own challenges in life. We have our own crucibles, trials by fire, obstacles that we have to overcome for our own self-growth. And that's what makes us admirable as human beings. And I often say, you know, Jesus, as I said, I grew up in the Christian church, and, you know, if Jesus was born perfect and he never sinned, then, you know, what inspiration is that to me, really? Here I'm going to offend Christians, but it's truly, I mean, how can I be inspired by somebody who never sinned, who never, I mean, the 40 days in the desert, well, we don't really know exactly what the temptations were, but if he was not a sinner, he'd never sinned, then, I mean, I don't know, how hard was it for him to resist those temptations? And I think it's more admirable, and I wanted to write a story about this wonderful, strong woman, and the only way to really develop strength is if you make mistakes. You have challenges and you overcome them. So I gave Aisha, I don't know what that is, but I gave her a challenge to overcome. And, it was of my own invention, but it was based on the things that we think really happened.
Okay, so I read The Sword of Medina, and I wasn't offended by it per se. I mean, I think I found things in there that, depending on if you were a Shia or a Sunni, you might find offensive, or yay, she told the truth, depending on kind of what agenda you're trying to push. And I can see that, based on some of the stories and how some of the historical characters are portrayed, because that whole Shia Sunni thing is still alive and thriving, today. I guess what I was more disappointed by was that there were two things. The first one is that I kind of felt like that first community of the companions was sort of special in that I think they allowed much more dialogue, much more give and take than the first, and that I felt was what sort of died out, especially during the reign of Uthman. That was part of the reason why he wanted to compile the Quran, was because those early memorizers were dying off. And I felt like the community didn't really come through in the book. It's kind of, there's a few mob scenes, there's a few, cheering, but there's not this sense of, of the community. And then the second thing I was disappointed by was I felt a lot of the power of Aisha and why she comes through and why we have her personality coming across the ages to us is because she outlived them all and she got to control the narrative. I mean, she had, students, and after Abu Huraira, she's the one with the most hadith attributed to her. And so that ability, that woman's ability to control the narrative, to pass down the stories, I just felt that didn't come through. I mean, granted, because, by the end of the book, you've already spent 200 pages describing that, but that kind of the power of storytelling, which I think is a feminine power and is still a power that women have because they do raise the next generation. I just felt that didn't come through enough. I felt that it was more about, patriarchy and skirts, Aisha getting to be the one in charge. And I feel part of the power of feminism is that ability to control the narrative. And I just didn't feel that came through. But I wasn't offended.
Yeah, well, I could have spent more time on that. I mean, I did. The last chapter of the book is all about that. It's sort of an epilogue to the main story, which is about the Sunni-Shia split and how that happened, and the Battle of the Camel. I mean, the whole book is leading up to the Battle of the Camel. That's why the chapters start long. As they alternate between Aisha and Ali, they start long and they get shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter to build the tension up to the battle. The last chapter is about her, does have her being the last one standing, how she secluded herself after losing that battle, and it has all the people in the courtyard waiting for her to come out and recite the Quran and tell stories about Muhammad. And I could have spent more time with that, but I just, even thinking about it now, I don't really know how I would have done that and have it be compelling. I mean, maybe I could have framed the whole book with her as a series of her stories. I don't know. But I really like that insight that you've had about women, her controlling the narrative. I guess I hadn't really thought of it even in those terms. But, she may have had more a hadith than anyone else, but, she's like more than half of them have been thrown out. So, and we can't, I don't know, we can't see them now, right? We don't, I mean, as far as I know, the ones that have been expunged have not, we can't read them. We don't know what they were. So I don't know ultimately how much control she had over the narrative. And as for Abu Huraira, there's a book by Fatima Mernissi. She's a Moroccan scholar.
Yep.
Yeah,
We
we've
all
all
read
read it.
Yeah.
What did you think of that book?
It's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, and she talks about Abu Huraira and how his hadith were all retained, even though she thinks he was a very unreliable narrator. And how Aisha even accused him of it. I mentioned that in one of my books too. Accused him of making up stories, and he said, "Well, I was following the prophet around while you were doing your hair, or while you were putting on your makeup, or something, some misogynist comment." But he seems to have also had a lot of power and control ultimately, in terms of sort of harming the. I just think that his hadith are really they're some of them are the antithesis of what Muhammad would seem to believe, at least in terms of how he lived his life and what he taught in terms of male-female relations. So I haven't had many. I've had some threats. I've had some anger from mostly men,
Sorry.
mostly men, and I couldn't really figure it out because these people had not read the book. I mean, the threats all happened before the book was even published.
Um,
Go ahead, Aisha.
oh, I'm sorry. But also, I think what happens with many Muslims is we grow up with one narrative or one view, one way of looking at the Prophet and his family, and we really don't question it. So that's why when an outsider supposedly, brings these things up, it makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I think the fact that I'm an American non-Muslim woman, that's like three strikes against me right there.
Right, but not us, right? Well, not me. I shouldn't speak.
Right. No.
But I mean, even who is worthy of transmitting the story, that'll vary. I mean, a Shia can be seen as,
Right.
a Sunni is not going to say any, I don't
Right.
believe anything those Shias say, so it's kind of who's in the in group. And you can be one of the best scholars. I mean, Karen Armstrong is routinely criticized, for her biography and her scholarship because she's not a Muslim. And it's like, have you read the book?
Right,
It's like,
exactly.
you read the book, you
Right.
won't be saying that.
Well, I know she portrays the Prophet Muhammad, as being so egalitarian and loving.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how can you argue with that if you're Muslim?
Right.
But
If you don't want to be egalitarian, you
Right,
might not
right.
like that.
right. Well, yeah, and that's what I was going to say. Is that one of the there was one of the most disturbing things that happened was that someone sent me I don't know if it was a fatwa, I don't know what you call it, but it was this long proclamation by someone in Bangladesh with a long name. And he said that, basically said with, 4 billion Muslims or something in the world, why is this woman still alive? And he referred to me as a feminist. And I thought, oh, that's it right there. I mean, because he hasn't read the book, it hadn't even been published yet. But I thought, why would he call me a feminist unless it was a problem for him? I've actually written a speech that didn't get accepted by Humanities Washington. It's called Muhammad Was a Feminist. And it's the speech is about how it's not Islam that oppresses women, it's patriarchy. And I firmly believe that it's men who want to keep women submissive, keep women in a subservient position, so that so they can feel like they have someone or something to be in charge of or in control of. And patriarchy isn't unique to Islam. It happens. It's happening. It's like the way the world runs. What runs the world now? And if we get to come around again the way some people would believe, I hope I get to come back to a matriarchy myself, and maybe Aisha will be queen or something. So.
Anyone else? Are we tired? We've been talking for an hour and a half.
I'm sure she is. I'm sure you are, Sherry.
Thank you
Thank
so much for doing
Yes.
this.
Well, gosh, I just love talking about my books. And, I don't really get to have these kinds of discussions that much anymore because The Jewel of Medina came out in 2008 and The Sword of Medina came out in 2009. And I've sort of moved on in history to medieval Europe, and with my next two books, my next three books actually, and then my next book I'm working on now is about the 1920s in France. So I really appreciate the chance to talk about these important issues, and we didn't talk about, we didn't even talk about what's happened in France.
Oh, God.
Like the 1920s.
Do you want to say anything about
Yeah,
that?
does that make you nervous at all?
No, I stopped being nervous a long time ago. When I was getting death threats, I had just moved to Spokane when all this stuff started happening, and I had moved from a town that's 200 miles away that I felt was my home, my home. And so because I was in sort of a strange place, I felt really insecure and frightened. And excuse me, I had a visit from some FBI agents, and after talking with them, I felt really, really terrified. And they actually came with me to my first reading. I did a reading here at Auntie's bookstore in Spokane from The Jewel of Medina and a talk about it, and about a few weeks after it came out, or maybe it was right when it came out. But anyway, the whole room was it was like the room was filled with FBI agents, all in Spokane anti-terrorism task force police officers, all standing around in their suits in a semicircle around the room, with their headsets. All really good-looking men, by the way. I got hugs. I get something out of it. So they were really, really great. But I was really, I lived daily in fear. And then, this is a good story to leave you with, I think. I ran away to Montana. I was getting, I didn't get a lot of threats. I only got a few. One was really, really disturbing on YouTube. Someone commented on a video that this Muslim group had made against my book, even though it hadn't come out yet. And someone said, "Let's do to her what we did to Theo Van Gogh," and they called me, various misogynist names, curse words, and of course, I stupidly did a Google search, right before I went to bed, so then I couldn't sleep. But I ran away to Montana, and I refused to do any interviews with the press. I just felt attacked and beleaguered. I'd had an interview with a reporter for an Arab American newspaper who he'd questioned me very hostilely, and I only had about 4.5 hours of sleep when I did the interview, because I'd been up at 12:30 in the morning or something for the BBC, so I was exhausted. And I told my boyfriend at the time, I'm leaving. I'm ditching. I'm getting out of Dodge. I'm going back to Missoula, which is where I was from, Missoula, Montana, where I had lived for 12 years, and I felt really safe there. And a friend of mine lived on a mountaintop and said, "Come stay with me, and no one will ever find you, and you can escape." And I did that, but then I did do an interview with the local newspaper there, and this reporter called me and said, "Did you hear what happened in Serbia?" And I said, "No. What about Serbia?" And she said, "Well, your book was published there." And I had no idea my book had been published in Serbia. Random House had sold the rights to publication there, and I guess someone forgot to give me the memo. And they didn't even know that Random House the contract had been canceled. They're publishing the book. They were the first ones in the world to bring it out. And a Muslim leader there, conservative Muslim leader, a mufti, they call him there, he came out with a statement, a press release, demanding that, saying my book contained brutal scenes of pornography, and demanding that my publisher withdraw the book from all the bookstores and turned over all copies to him. Apparently they wanted to burn all the copies of my book. So, what happened after that was that that was on Saturday, and on Monday, my publisher, who was also very frightened at the time in Serbia, he went to the bookstores to get the book, and they had all sold out. So that was kind of cool. But when this happened,
to sell stuff.
yeah, when this happened, it totally freaked me out. And the Serbian newspaper, Blitz in Belgrade, they had been trying to reach me, and this reporter in Missoula told me they were looking for me. And so I reluctantly called or got in contact via email with the editor there. And he said, "Well, we want to run a special issue on censorship, because it hasn't been long since Slobodan Milosevic, the communist dictator who was over Serbia and other countries, that it hasn't been too long since he was in charge, and we just got our freedom back, and we're not going to give up. We just got our freedom of speech, and we're not going to give it up, and we're going to fight this effort to suppress our free speech, and we would like it if you would write a piece for us for this special issue." And I was just so stressed out and scared and anxious, and I said, "I'll have to think about it." And I was crying. I was very upset. My boyfriend had come to Missoula to pick me up, and I went upstairs into the guest room of the house where I was staying, and I was packing my bag, and I just kept thinking about, I just was imagining this professor had predicted the professor in Texas had predicted there would be riots in the streets, people would lose their lives, and I just kept thinking about that, like and I was thinking, what have I done? And I had to remind myself that all I did was write a book, and that I can't control how people react to it or how people respond. But I just felt this tension and this pressure just building and building, and I felt this feeling of despair. I didn't know what I was going to do, and as I said, I'm not a religious person at all, and I looked out the window. It was this high window. It was a beautiful sunny day, and there was this high window in the bedroom that was looking out into this beautiful blue sky, and I looked out the window and I just said, "Help me." And I closed my eyes, and I saw Aisha. In my mind's eye, I saw Aisha standing there with her feet apart, her long hair, her hijab, her long hair, and her sword. And I thought at the time that these thoughts came to me: love, courage, strength, and peace. And those became my mantras from that time on. And I, at that moment, lost all my fear. I mean, I'm going to start crying just talking about this. I lost all my fear in that moment. I felt the spirit of Aisha. I wouldn't say that it was really her. It was actually probably the aspect of me that, as authors or anyone who does anything creative, we create out of ourselves, out of our own experiences and something within ourselves. And that's what I drew upon, this aspects of Aisha that came out of me, whatever drove me to write about her. And I was reminded that she is in me, and she's in those aspects of her, that strength and that courage and that peace and that compassion and love for others is in all of us. And I decided at that moment that I was going to write that piece, and also that I was not going to succumb anymore. I wasn't going to cower on the mountaintop anymore. I was going to come down and live my life. And I started telling people that I would rather think about how I want to live. I'm not going to sit around worrying about how I'm going to die. I want to think about, instead, focus on how I want to live my life. And so, I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not afraid to die. I'm not afraid. The editor of Charlie Hebdo said, I would rather die standing than live on my knees. And I really can't, I couldn't say it better, frankly. So that's a long answer again. I'm not afraid at all.
That's great.
Yeah, I guess my feeling on France is, everybody's saying Je suis Charlie, but there's, among the Muslims, they're saying Je suis Ahmed, because there was one of the policemen was a Muslim, and he was shot, by the attackers. And I guess that's kind of how I feel, is that, I'm a Muslim. I will respect your right to say whatever you want to say. I may not agree with it. I may not like it, but you have that human right to say, what you think and what you feel, within the bounds, of course. I mean, not everybody's going to say, we don't have complete free speech, but it's not. We live in a society where humor is one of our tools for criticism, and if you want to live here, you have to accept that, as what's going on. I don't know.
I would just add to that I feel the same way you do, that we have to not be afraid, and this war that we're all in has no boundaries, and somebody like you is as much a part of it as we all are. And it's not just on the battlefield. It's a war of it's a war of stories, and it's a war of moving forward, and nobody is immune from it. It's like there are no borders anymore. There are no boundaries anymore. So I think all of us have to take a stand. It's crazy. It's crazy for me to think, in my lifetime, that we've come to this point where wars are not being fought just by soldiers. Wars are being fought by authors and mothers and policemen and journalists and cartoonists, for heaven's sake. It's, but that's where we are.
Well, I lost my train of thought. Oh, when Islamophobes talk to me about it, I always say, I point out that Muslims are the #1 victim of terrorism. And
True.
And anybody knows that Muhammad would never have countenanced that, at least. He forgave, what was Abu Sufyan's wife's name? That woman
Hind.
Hind. He forgave her. And look at all the inciting she did against him. And it's not... it's just not Islam that's doing that, and I feel really bad for Muslims around the world who are now having to suffer the consequences of bigotry and Islamophobia because of the actions of these violent extremists.
Yeah.
So I really want to continue to speak out against that. I really thought at the time when it happened that I should write something. but I didn't at the moment because I felt a little uncomfortable that I would be seen as trying to somehow promote my book or cash in off the tragedy. But I do stand very solidly, for freedom of speech. And even though I hate Islamophobic speech, I hate any speech that incites hatred against anyone, especially any group of people, but really against anyone. But I also understand that we have to have that, or if we start silencing one type of speech, then where do we stop? So we have to allow it all.
Well, and the crazy thing for me is that, one of the most oft repeated ayahs from Quran is that there can be no coercion in religion. And if you don't have free speech, that ayah is meaningless. So for me, you have to start from there. We have to have free speech. It's a requirement to have faith. If you don't have free speech, faith is meaningless. It means nothing. If we're all told what to believe and how to believe and we don't have freedom of choice, what is faith?
Well,
I know. Nabila's sitting here saying that's your Americanism coming through.
Well, I feel very.
I can't help it. I'm American.
I feel so encouraged by how the Muslim communities are encouraging their imams now, and their I don't know. Do they still have caliphs in Sunni Islam? You never hear about any prominent. Anyway.
In Shia Islam, sorry, in Sunni Islam they have imams and sheikhs.
All the sects have their own thing.
But there is no caliph anymore, right?
But anyway, they're encouraging their religious leaders in Muslim communities, and are now speaking out against terrorism and encouraging their religious leaders to actually do the same. And that's one criticism I've heard so often from people who are suspicious of Islam or cynical about it. It's like, where are all the Muslim voices? Where are the Muslims speaking out? And I always say, well, if you're not hearing them, you're not checking the right sources.
Yeah.
I know
isolated in our little enclaves, and we don't hear what we're saying.
Yes, but I have read that that many Muslim communities are starting to rise up and speak out against terror and against extremism, and that's so encouraging. If that can come out of this massacre in Paris, then those journalists won't have died in vain.
Yeah. Okay. So Sherry, thank you so much for your time. We
It's my pleasure.
appreciated this.
I really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it.
I'd like to end just by saying that I don't see why Jewel of Medina or Sword of Medina can't be used in Islamic schools. Who knows, 50 years from now, or 25 years from now, whatever. Yeah, who knows?
Well,
who knows?
Hopefully I'll live to see that happen.
Yeah.
I mentioned that at the University of Minnesota, a professor, Michael Lackey, did use The Jewel of Medina, did teach that book in a graduate class, English studies class. I think it was a religion and literature or something class. And he said that I asked him what it was about my book that had made it special, because one of the students told me when I was in Minneapolis, one of the students told me that they were challenged in the class to come up with another book that had done what mine had done. But the student never said what that was, and I didn't ask. And I asked Professor Lackey later, what was it that my book has done that these students couldn't come up with any other examples of? And he said, well, that my book was a novel that portrays Islam in a positive light. So and it is so historically accurate. I would hope that it could be used in that way. And My other dream is that the Jewel of Medina and the Sword of Medina would be translated into Arabic for readers in Arabic-speaking countries to be able to read, especially women. And I haven't yet figured out how to make that happen. I don't have a resource. I don't know who could do it. It would have to be a literary translator because it can't just be straight translation. There are too many different. It's complex for literature. I know that it's been banned in Egypt. I went to a bookstore there. They tried to get permission to sell my book when I was there, and the Egyptian government, the censorship bureau, wouldn't let them do that. And it's been banned in Malaysia, and
because they're afraid of the reaction. Because the current government's cracking down on all the Muslim groups, but my sisters-in-law are Egyptian, and they would eat it up, and my Egyptian nieces would eat it up because they're hungry for this kind of thing now. They're so confused about what Islam means to them. The Muslim groups have been totally discredited and outlawed, completely outlawed. So people are very confused. I think it'd be a great audience, but obviously, if it's been banned, then that's not going to happen now.
Have you tried Dubai? I mean, I don't know, outlets through Dubai.
My publisher, Beaufort Books, has a sales representative that works in the Middle Eastern countries, and he has not been successful in getting anyone there to carry the Jewel of Medina.
And it doesn't matter. It's they haven't even read it. I'm sure none of them have read it. They don't know what's in it. It's just they're afraid of the reaction.
It's just, I feel like it's just a matter of time.
Well, I think so too, and I think it's a matter of time before I find an Arabic language publisher too. The rights to the Jewel of Medina will revert from my American publisher to me in October of this year, October of 2015, and at that point I'll be focusing on getting it out in paperback, which it never has been published in paperback, and so therefore you can't find it in a lot of bookstores. And I would like to get it out there in paperback, and I would also like to find someone to translate it into Arabic. And I'm thinking of doing what Irshad Manji did. She had her book, The Trouble with Islam, translated into Arabic, and then she is offering it's free. It's free in Arabic, and I would love to do that, to be able to make it free, to get an Arabic language edition of the Jewel of Medina and the Sword of Medina, and make them available so that Arabic-speaking people, as I said, especially women, but I've had a lot of Muslim men write to me who love my book, who love the Jewel of Medina. So that's very gratifying also.
Okay. Well, good luck to you then.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Great meeting you all.
Okay.
Bye-bye.